November 2nd, 1943. Empress Augusta Bay, off Bougainville. Midnight darkness over the Solomon Sea. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger stands on the bridge of USS Charles Osborne, lead destroyer of Destroyer Squadron 23. His eyes adjust to the blackness. No moon tonight, just stars and the phosphorescence trailing from his ship's wake. Behind him, 3 more Fletcher-class destroyers cut through calm water in perfect column. Claxton, Dyson, and Spence. Each vessel carries something the Japanese have not yet accounted for in their tactical calculations. 10 Mark 15 torpedoes, 2 quintuple mounts, 20 fish between just 2 ships if you count a division, 40 across a full squadron. The Japanese think they know American destroyer doctrine. They have studied it, planned against it, and designed their own tactics to exploit what they believe are predictable patterns. American destroyers, they have been told, rely on guns. They close to medium range, use radar fire control, and depend on volume of fire. The long-lance torpedo, Japan's oxygen-fueled Type 93, is supposed to be the equalizer, the weapon that negates American technological advantages in the night. But intelligence flows both ways, and American designers have been watching, learning, and building. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Fletcher-class represents a revolution hiding in plain sight. At 376 feet, these destroyers are larger than their predecessors. Displacement runs to 2,050 tons standard, closer to 3,000 tons fully loaded. 5 single 5-inch, 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in enclosed mounts, 10 40mm Bofors in twin mounts, 7 20mm Oerlikon cannons scattered across the superstructure. But the real surprise sits amidships. 2 quintuple 21-inch torpedo tube mounts, port and starboard, each tube loaded with a Mark 15 torpedo carrying 825 pounds of TNT in the warhead. The Mark 15 is no long lance. It runs on steam generated by burning alcohol and compressed air. Range tops out around 15,000 yards at 26.5 knots, or 6,000 yards at 45 knots. The Japanese Type 93 can reach out past 40,000 yards with a half-ton warhead running on pure oxygen that leaves almost no wake. On paper, the long lance dominates. In practice, war is not fought on paper. Moosbrugger has spent months drilling his squadron. Night approaches, radar tracking, torpedo geometry. The Fletcher's fire control system integrates radar with a Mark 37 director for the guns and a separate torpedo data computer that takes ranges, bearings, target speed, and course, then spits out firing solutions. This is not the kind of torpedo attack the Japanese expect. There will be no visual estimation of range by eye, no manual plotting on a chart under a red lamp. The radar does the seeing. The computer does the thinking. The men execute. The radio crackles. Radar contact. A Japanese force inbound from Rabaul. 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers. Vice Admiral Omori commands from heavy cruiser Myoko. His orders are clear. Intercept the American landing force at Empress Augusta Bay. Destroy the transports, and disrupt the amphibious operation. Omori's ships are powerful. Myoko and Haguro displace over 13,000 tons each, mount 10 8-inch guns, and carry Type 93 torpedoes in quadruple mounts. Light cruisers Sendai and Haguro add more guns and more torpedoes. The destroyer screen includes veteran units from the Tokyo Express runs down the slot. Rear Admiral Aaron Stanton Merrill commands the American force from light cruiser Montpelier. He has 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, including Moosbrugger's Desron 23. Merrill knows he is outgunned in a traditional surface engagement. His cruisers are Brooklyn and Cleveland-class vessels. Fast, well-armed with 6-inch guns, excellent radar, but not built to trade punches with heavy cruisers at close range. His advantage lies in coordination, radar, fire control, and the destroyers. At 0145 hours, the formations close. Range drops below 20,000 yards. Merrill's cruisers open fire first. Radar-directed salvos arc through darkness. Star shells burst overhead, casting eerie white light across the water. The Japanese column reacts. Omori orders his ships to turn, trying to bring broadsides to bear. Confusion spreads through his formation. Some ships turn left, others turn right. The column fractures. Moosbrugger sees his moment. He detaches his division from the main formation and races forward. The Fletchers accelerate to 34 knots. Their hulls, designed with a long forecastle and raised bow, cut cleanly through the chop, engineering spaces humming with the rhythm of geared turbines spinning at 60,000 shaft horsepower. The boilers, running at 600 pounds per square inches and superheated to 850 degrees Fahrenheit, pour steam into the turbines. Fuel consumption spikes to over 100 gallons per minute at flank speed, but endurance is not the concern tonight. Hitting hard is. The radar plot updates every sweep: range, bearing, target angle. The torpedo data computer, a mechanical analog device of gears and cams, ingests the information. Operators turn dials. The solution locks. Moosbrugger gives the order. Fire. The quintuple mounts swivel. Compressed air charges build in the impulse cylinders. One by one, the Mark 15 torpedoes eject from their tubes. 10 weapons in the water from Osborne and Claxton in under 30 seconds. The torpedoes drop, their contra-rotating propellers bite, and they settle into their runs. No visible wakes in the darkness. The Japanese do not see them coming. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding destroyer Haguro, would later write about the night battles in the Solomons with a mixture of respect and dread for American destroyer tactics. Hara survived more surface actions than almost any other Japanese destroyer captain. He understood the sea, understood his ship, and understood his enemy. But even Hara admitted that by late 1943, the Americans had learned to fight at night with a precision that erased the Japanese advantage in optics and seamanship. The Mark 15 torpedoes converge on the Japanese column. The targets are still trying to sort out their formation. Sendai, the lead light cruiser, takes the first hit. The explosion rips into her port side amidships. Seawater floods into the engine rooms. Power fails. The cruiser slews to a stop, listing heavily. 2 more torpedoes slam into Haguro. The heavy cruiser shudders but remains afloat, her damage control teams fighting flooding in multiple compartments. A 4th torpedo finds destroyer Samidare. The detonation breaks her keel. She goes down in less than 4 minutes. Omori's force dissolves into chaos. Ships scatter. Some try to return fire, but targeting is nearly impossible. The American destroyers are moving at high speed, weaving, and the Japanese gunners are shooting at radar blips, muzzle flashes. Meanwhile, Merrill's cruisers continue their methodical bombardment. 6-inch shells walk across the Japanese formation. Sendai takes multiple hits. Fires spread. Her magazines cook off in a secondary explosion that lights up the entire bay. Moosbrugger's destroyers reload. Not all Fletcher-class ships carried reload torpedoes in their ready racks during this period, but the capability existed, and some captains insisted on it, despite the added top-weight risk. Osborne carries 4 reloads. The torpedo crews, drilled endlessly in peacetime and sharpened by combat, manhandle the 3,000-pound weapons from the racks to the tubes. In 14 minutes, they have 2 tubes reloaded and ready. Moosbrugger does not need them tonight. The Japanese are already retreating. By 0400 hours, the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay is over. Omori withdraws toward Rabaul with a battered force. Sendai sinks. Haguro limps away with heavy damage. Samidare is gone. Another destroyer, Hatsukaze, suffers severe damage from gunfire and barely makes port. American losses are comparatively light. One destroyer, USS Foote, takes a long-lance hit that blows off her stern, but she survives and is towed to safety. No ships lost. The shock for the Japanese is not just the tactical defeat, it is the realization that American destroyers have become torpedo combatants on par with their own, but backed by radar, fire control computers, and an industrial base that can replace losses overnight. Japanese doctrine had always emphasized the torpedo as the great equalizer in night combat. Their destroyers trained endlessly in torpedo attacks. The Type 93 was a point of pride, a technological edge that balanced the American advantage in radar and production. But when American destroyers started appearing with 10 torpedoes per ship, and the electronics to target them accurately at ranges where visual identification was impossible, the calculus changed. After Empress Augusta Bay, Japanese naval intelligence began circulating reports about the new American destroyer class. The specifications were alarming. Not just the torpedo capacity, but the overall combat power. 5-inch guns that could engage aircraft or surface targets with equal effectiveness. Dual-purpose fire control that allowed seamless transitions between anti-air and anti-surface modes. Speed to keep pace with fast carrier task forces or to run down enemy convoys. Range to cross the Pacific without constant refueling. The Fletcher-class entered service in mid-1942. By late 1943, they were everywhere. The Atlantic, the Pacific, the Mediterranean. Production ramped at an unprecedented pace. Bath Iron Works in Maine, Federal Shipbuilding in New Jersey, Bethlehem Steel in San Francisco, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, Consolidated Steel in Texas, Gulf Shipbuilding in Alabama. At peak production, American yards were completing a Fletcher-class destroyer every 8 days. Japan's entire destroyer production in 1943 totaled 19 ships. The United States commissioned 67 Fletchers that same year. Each Fletcher cost approximately $6 million in 1943 dollars. Adjusted for inflation and accounting for the wartime economy, that represents an enormous industrial effort, but spread across the scale of American manufacturing, it was manageable. Japan's economy, strangled by submarine warfare and stretched across a vast defensive perimeter, could not match it. Every destroyer lost was a blow. Every damaged ship meant months in dock, resources diverted, and a gap in the screen. The men who served on Fletchers came from every corner of the United States, farm boys from Iowa learning to operate radar systems, factory workers from Detroit becoming gunners' mates, college students from New England navigating by stars and gyro compass. The training pipeline funneled them through boot camp, technical schools, and shakedown cruises, then delivered them to the fleet with a competence that would have seemed impossible in 1940. Lieutenant Commander Erasmus Red Johnson took command of USS the Sullivans in early 1943, named for the 5 Sullivan brothers lost on USS Juneau at Guadalcanal. The ship carried a weight of expectation. Johnson drove his crew hard, damage control drills, until men could plug a simulated hull breach in under 2 minutes, gunnery practice until the 5-inch mounts could sustain 20 rounds per minute per gun, torpedo drills until the firing sequence became muscle memory. When the Sullivans joined the fleet, she was ready. The ship's first major action came during the Gilbert Islands campaign in November 1943. Tasked with shore bombardment and anti-aircraft screening, the Sullivans fired over 1,200 rounds of 5-inch ammunition in support of the landings on Tarawa. Japanese aircraft attacked repeatedly. The 40mm and 20mm mounts erupted in overlapping fields of fire. 3 confirmed kills, no damage taken. Johnson pushed his crew through the entire operation, without rest, rotating only the essential personnel for sleep. By the time the island was secured, the men were exhausted but blooded. The Fletcher's design matured through combat experience. Early ships suffered from top-weight issues as more anti-aircraft guns were added. Later vessels received modifications to the superstructure and mast configuration to lower the center of gravity. The torpedo directors were refined. The depth charge racks, initially positioned aft, were adjusted for safer handling. Radar antennas proliferated SG surface search, SC air search, and eventually SPS-6 and SPS-8 models as technology advanced. What the Japanese found most unsettling was the redundancy built into American systems. If the main radar failed, there was a backup. If the torpedo data computer went down, the crew could fall back on manual plotting. If one boiler took a hit, the other 3 could still drive the ship at reduced speed. This was not the fragility of ships designed to maximize firepower at the expense of survivability. This was a platform built to absorb punishment and keep fighting. By early 1944, Fletcher-class destroyers were at the tip of every major American offensive in the Pacific. They screened carriers during the Marshall Islands raids. They hunted submarines in the approaches to the Philippines. They stood radar picket duty off Saipan and Guam, intercepting kamikaze attacks before they reached the transports. And always, the 10 torpedoes sat ready in their tubes, a reserve of striking power that could turn a surface engagement in seconds. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders cannot be overstated. Pre-war doctrine assumed that American destroyers would be gun platforms, useful for screening and anti-submarine work, but secondary in surface combat. The appearance of heavily armed, radar-equipped destroyers with torpedo batteries equal to or greater than Japanese designs forced a doctrinal rethink that came too late and with too few resources to implement effectively. By the time Japanese planners acknowledged the threat, American production had already flooded the Pacific with Fletchers. The numbers tell the story. From 1,942 to 1,945, 175 Fletcher-class destroyers were commissioned. They served in every theater, fought in every major engagement, and formed the backbone of the American destroyer force through the end of the war. Losses were inevitable. 19 Fletchers were sunk by enemy action, but the rate of replacement far exceeded the rate of attrition. For every Fletcher lost, 3 more joined the fleet. In the dark waters off Bougainville, as Osborne and her sisters turned away from the shattered Japanese column, Moosbrugger allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The torpedoes had done their work. The radar had seen what eyes could not. The crew had executed flawlessly. But more than that, the engagement had proven a point. American destroyers were no longer supporting players in the naval war. They were killers, and the 10 torpedoes on each Fletcher made sure the enemy knew it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The shockwave from Empress Augusta Bay rippled through the Imperial Japanese Navy's command structure faster than any torpedo. Within 72 hours, Vice Admiral Tomoshige Samejima convened an emergency assessment at the Naval Staff Headquarters in Tokyo. The losses themselves were troubling but explicable within the context of modern naval warfare. What demanded explanation was the manner of defeat. Captain Kiyoshi Kobayashi, one of the few destroyer captains to observe the American attack pattern and survive, provided testimony that contradicted every assumption the Navy General Staff had made about American destroyer employment. Kobayashi described the American approach with clinical precision. The enemy destroyers had not charged in a wild melee, as some of the older battleship admirals imagined American tactics to be. They had not scattered when confronted with superior firepower. Instead, they had maintained formation, used electronic devices to track targets in total darkness, and delivered torpedo salvos with a timing precision that suggested mechanical calculation rather than human estimation. Most disturbing of all, the volume of torpedoes exceeded anything Japanese intelligence had projected for vessels of that displacement. The staff intelligence officers pulled files. The Fletcher-class destroyer had been identified in reconnaissance photographs as early as mid-1942, but analysis had focused primarily on gun armament and anti-aircraft capabilities. The assumption had been that American designers, following their historical pattern, would sacrifice torpedo capacity for other systems. After all, the previous generation of American destroyers, the Benson and Gleaves classes, carried only 1 quintuple mount, 5 torpedoes. The doubling to 10 tubes had somehow slipped past the analysts, or perhaps been noted but not properly weighted in tactical assessments. Commander Hideo Tanaka, attached to the Naval Technical Bureau, requested permission to re-examine the Fletcher specifications using captured documents and intelligence gathered from neutral observers. What he discovered confirmed Kobayashi's account. The Americans had indeed installed 2 quintuple mounts as standard equipment across the entire Fletcher class. Moreover, design documents suggested the mounts could train rapidly, reload relatively quickly compared to fixed installations, and interface with fire control systems that processed radar data directly. Tanaka's report went deeper than surface specifications. He examined maintenance logs from captured destroyer equipment and interrogation reports from American prisoners who had served in engineering divisions. What emerged was a picture of mechanical reliability that bordered on the obsessive. American torpedoes, while less spectacular than the Type 93, ran true to their settings 95% of the time. The pneumatic ejection system rarely failed. The gyroscopes stabilized within seconds of launch. Even the depth-keeping mechanism, a persistent problem in early war American torpedoes, had been refined to acceptable tolerances by mid-1943. Japanese torpedoes, by contrast, were maintenance nightmares. The Type 93's oxygen system required specialized handling. Improperly purged lines could explode during routine operations. The fuel mixture had to be precisely calibrated. Storage temperatures affected performance. Crews trained for months just to achieve basic competence in handling the weapons, and even then, accidents occurred with disturbing regularity. A destroyer captain who fired all his long lances in a single engagement could not realistically expect to reload at sea. The process required shore facilities, trained technicians, and time, measured in days rather than hours. The Fletchers Mark 15 torpedoes, simpler in design and robust in construction, could be reloaded by the ship's crew in less than 20 minutes per tube under ideal conditions. Combat conditions stretched that timeline, but multiple Fletcher captains reported successful reloads during lulls in night engagements. This capability transformed tactical planning. A Fletcher division could enter combat, fire 20 torpedoes, withdraw briefly, reload half their tubes, and return to the fight with 10 more weapons ready. Japanese destroyers fired once and became gun platforms for the remainder of the engagement. The implications cascaded through every level of Japanese naval planning. If American destroyers could deliver massed torpedo attacks guided by radar, then the fundamental assumption underlying Japanese night-fighting doctrine that superior optics and training would allow Japanese forces to strike first was obsolete. The Type 93 Long Lance remained a formidable weapon, but its advantage in range meant little if the enemy could see through darkness and calculate firing solutions, while Japanese crews were still searching for silhouettes against the horizon. Admiral Kondo Nobutake, commanding the fleet forces assigned to the defense of Rabaul, received the intelligence reports with grim recognition. He had spent 3 decades in the Imperial Navy, rising through destroyer commands to cruiser divisions and finally to flag rank. He understood destroyer warfare at a visceral level, and he understood what the Fletcher-class represented. It was not merely a new ship design. It was the manifestation of an entirely different industrial and tactical philosophy. Kondo convened a wargame at Rabaul in December 1943, using the most current intelligence on American destroyer capabilities. He assigned his best destroyer captains to command the American side, forcing them to think like their enemy. The game ran through 3 iterations, each time modeling a night surface engagement between roughly equal forces. In all 3 scenarios, the American side won decisively. The radar advantage proved insurmountable. The side that saw first, calculated first, and fired first controlled the engagement. Japanese advantages in optical rangefinders and crew training became irrelevant when the Americans opened fire from beyond visual range. Captain Tamechi Hara participated in the wargame. As commander of destroyer Shigure, he had survived more surface actions than almost any officer in the combined fleet. He had fought in the Java Sea, the Solomons, Vela La Vela, and Empress Augusta Bay. His ship bore scars from dozens of engagements. His crew was among the most experienced in the Navy, and yet, commanding the Japanese side in the wargame, he found himself consistently outmaneuvered by officers playing American tactics. Hara understood the problem at a fundamental level that many senior officers did not. Japanese destroyer doctrine had evolved during the 1,930 seconds, when the Type 93 torpedo was the wonder weapon that would equalize Japan's numerical inferiority to potential adversaries. Training emphasized the massed torpedo attack, entire divisions launching simultaneously to saturate a target area. Gunnery was secondary. Radar was a curiosity, interesting but not essential. This doctrine worked brilliantly in 1942, when American destroyers were still learning to use their new radar systems, and Japanese crews had a decade of peacetime training behind them. By late 1943, the equation had inverted. American crews now had 2 years of combat experience. Their radar systems had improved through multiple iterations. The fire control computers had been debugged and refined. And critically, the industrial base behind them could replace any losses within weeks. Japanese destroyers lost at Guadalcanal or Vela Gulf were gone forever. Fletcher-class destroyers sunk in, the same actions were replaced by 3 more. Within a month, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, rotated to shore duty after years flying in the Solomons, found himself assigned to tactical analysis. His experience fighting American carrier aircraft gave him a perspective the surface warfare officers lacked. He recognized in the Fletcher the same pattern he had seen in the evolution of American fighters. Early war models had been adequate, but not exceptional. The F-4F Wildcat was slower than the Zero, less maneuverable, and climbed poorly. Yet, by 1943, the Americans were fielding F-6F Hellcats that matched or exceeded Japanese fighters in every category except perhaps turn radius, and that single advantage meant nothing when American pilots fought in pairs with radio coordination and tactical discipline. Sakai wrote a report that his superiors largely ignored. In it, he argued that Japan could not win a war of attrition against an enemy capable of producing ships, aircraft, and weapons faster than they could be destroyed. He suggested that Japanese forces should focus on defensive operations, making each American advance as costly as possible, while husbanding resources for the inevitable defense of the home islands. The report was filed and forgotten. The Navy General Staff was not ready to admit that the war was unwinnable. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, who would soon assume command of the combined fleet, insisted that one decisive battle could still turn the tide. The Americans could be hurt badly enough that they would negotiate a favorable peace. This thinking, divorced from industrial and logistical reality, guided Japanese planning through 1944 and into 1945. In the waters around the Solomon Islands, Fletcher-class destroyers continued their work. USS Nicholas intercepted a Tokyo Express run in January 1944, sinking 2 Japanese destroyers and a transport with a combination of torpedo and gunfire. The engagement lasted 43 minutes. Nicholas fired 8 torpedoes, achieving 3 hits. Her 5-inch guns fired 847 rounds. The 40mm mounts expended 2,200 rounds. The ship took 1 hit from a Japanese 5-inch shell that penetrated the forward deckhouse, killing 3 men and wounding 7. Damage control teams had the fires extinguished and the compartment sealed within 8 minutes. Nicholas remained on station for another 6 hours before retiring to Purvis Bay for repairs that took 4 days. USS O'Bannon fought a bizarre engagement against Japanese submarine RO, 34 inches April 1944. The submarine surfaced unexpectedly directly ahead of the destroyer, while O'Bannon was conducting an anti-submarine sweep off the Russell Islands. The range closed to less than 50 yards before either crew fully recognized the situation. O'Bannon's main guns could not depress far enough to engage. The 40mm mounts had insufficient time to train. In the confusion, crew members on the fantail began throwing potatoes intended for the galley at the Japanese sailors on the submarine's deck. The Japanese, perhaps, believing the potatoes were grenades, dove for cover. This gave O'Bannon's gun crews precious seconds to bring weapons to bear. The 20mm cannons raked the submarine's conning tower. The 40mm mounts found their angle and punched holes through the pressure hull. RO-34 attempted to dive, but flooding was too severe. The submarine sank stern first. O'Bannon rescued 5 survivors. The incident became legend, retold in sailors' messes, and embellished with each telling. The official Navy historian later documented the engagement, confirming the essential facts, if not every colourful detail. But beneath the humour lay a truth. American destroyers were everywhere, aggressive and willing to improvise. The Fletcher's design encouraged this aggressiveness. The ship was fast enough to chase submarines on the surface, stable enough to maintain gunnery accuracy at high speed, and tough enough to close to point-blank range without excessive risk. The destroyer sailors themselves came to understand their ships through experience that no training manual could provide. Ensign Robert Miller joined USS Heermann fresh from Officers' Candidate School in Newport in February 1944. His academy training had covered navigation, engineering principles, and naval tactics, but nothing prepared him for the reality of shipboard life in a war zone. His first night at sea, the ship went to general quarters for a radar contact that turned out to be a rain squall. His second night, the contact was real, a Japanese cruiser-destroyer force attempting to reinforce Truk. The resulting engagement lasted 3 hours. Miller learned more about destroyer combat in those 3 hours than in 6 months of schooling. The 5-inch guns fired until the barrels glowed cherry red in the darkness. Each gun could sustain 15 to 20 rounds per minute with a well-drilled crew. Heermann's 5 mounts fired over 400 rounds that night. The deck vibrated with each salvo. Spent brass casings piled up in the handling. Rooms faster than loaders could kick them aside. The smoke and cordite fumes made breathing difficult, even with ventilation systems running at full capacity. The 40mm mounts engaged targets so close that tracer rounds seemed to arc in slow motion before impacting. One Japanese destroyer closed to 4,000 yards before Heermann's torpedoes forced it to break off. The weapons launched with a pneumatic hiss and a jolt that ran through the deck plates. Miller, stationed in the Combat Information Center, watched the radar plot as 10 white pips separated from the ship's position and tracked toward the enemy formation. And through it all, the radar antenna rotated, the fire control computer clicked and whirred, and the men executed their tasks with a focus born of training and adrenaline. Miller noticed that the crew spoke very little during the engagement. Commands were terse, acknowledgements shorter still. Each man knew his job so thoroughly that words were almost unnecessary. The loader knew when to slam the next round into the breech. The pointer knew when to adjust elevation. The fire controlman knew when the solution was good enough to authorize firing. This coordination, this collective competence, was not accidental. It was the product of endless drills, of maintenance schedules that kept equipment functioning at peak efficiency, of a training pipeline that delivered technically proficient sailors to the fleet. Heermann survived that night without serious damage. The Japanese did not. One cruiser sunk, one destroyer blown in half, another destroyer burning and abandoned. The American force withdrew at high speed, refueled from fleet oiler USS Guadalupe the next morning, and was back on patrol by evening. This was the tempo that broke the Japanese Navy, not the spectacular carrier battles that made headlines, but the grinding, relentless pressure of destroyers that never seemed to run out of fuel, ammunition, or replacement crews. The logistics that supported Fletcher-class operations were themselves a marvel of coordination. Each destroyer consumed approximately 6,000 gallons of fuel oil per day at cruising speed, more at flank speed. Ammunition expenditure varied, but a typical war patrol might burn through 2,000 rounds of 5-inch, 5,000 rounds of 40mm, and 10,000 rounds of 20mm. Food, fresh water, spare parts, lubricants, medical supplies all had to flow continuously from rear bases to forward areas. The service force, Pacific Fleet, operated a logistical network that stretched from Pearl Harbor to Ulithi to forward anchorages like Manus and Purvis Bay. Fleet oilers met destroyers at predetermined coordinates, conducting underway replenishment that took 2 to 3 hours. Ammunition ships transferred shells and powder while both vessels steamed in parallel at 12 knots. Repair ships patched battle damage and performed maintenance that would have required a major shipyard in any previous war. This system allowed Fletcher-class destroyers to remain forward deployed for months at a time, returning to major bases only for overhauls that were themselves streamlined to minimize out-of-service time. Japanese destroyers, by contrast, operated on increasingly fragile supply lines. Fuel oil stocks dwindled as American submarines savaged the tanker fleet. Quality control in ammunition production suffered as experienced workers were drafted into combat units. Spare parts became scarce, then unobtainable. By mid-1944, Japanese destroyers were cannibalizing damaged ships for components that could no longer be manufactured. A destroyer captain who expended his full ammunition load in combat might wait weeks for resupply, rendering his ship effectively useless for anything beyond basic patrol duties. By mid-1944, the strategic situation had shifted fundamentally. The Marianas were in American hands. Saipan fell in July after a month of brutal fighting. Tinian and Guam followed. The fall of these islands placed American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. But more immediately, it created forward bases for the fast carrier task forces and their destroyer screens. Fletcher-class destroyers operated from Saipan's new anchorage, cutting weeks off the transit time to the Philippines. The Philippines campaign, launched in October 1944, became the crucible where the Fletcher-class proved its worth beyond any remaining doubt. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, involved hundreds of ships across multiple separate actions. Fletcher-class destroyers participated in every phase: the initial landings, the Battle of Surigao Strait, and most dramatically, the Battle off Samar. The Battle off Samar in October 1944 provided the most dramatic demonstration of Fletcher-class capabilities under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. Admiral Kurita Takeo's center force, having transited San Bernardino Strait during the night, emerged into Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25th. The force comprised 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Directly in their path lay Task Unit 77.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The escort carriers, CVEs converted from merchant hulls, were slow, lightly armed, and carried aircraft optimized for anti-submarine warfare and ground support, not fleet engagement. The 3 destroyers were USS Johnston, Hole, and Heermann, all Fletcher-class. Their combined firepower represented 15 5-inch guns and 30 torpedoes. The Japanese force mounted over 180 heavy guns, ranging from 6-inch to the 18.1-inch monsters on Yamato. The weight of broadside favored the Japanese by a factor of approximately 50-1. The logical response would have been immediate retreat under smoke. The destroyers attacked instead. USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer under Commander Ernest Evans, charged directly at the Japanese battleship Yamato. Evans was a Native American officer from Oklahoma, commissioned through the Naval Academy in 1931, and known for aggressive leadership that bordered on recklessness. His commissioning speech to Johnston's crew when the ship entered service had been brief. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. Now, 2 years later, Evans put those words into action. Johnston accelerated to flank speed, her 4 Babcock and Wilcox boilers driving the twin screws to 60,000 shaft horsepower. Black smoke poured from her stacks. The ship heeled into a turn, presenting her torpedo mounts to the enemy. Range closed from 35,000 yards to 20,000, then 15,000. Japanese shells began falling around the destroyer, massive geysers of seawater erupting where 14-inch and 16-inch projectiles struck. Evans held course. At 10,000 yards, 5 nautical miles, he ordered all 10, torpedoes fired in a single salvo. The Mark 15 seconds leaped from their tubes, entered the water, and began their runs. Evans immediately threw Johnston into a hard turn, disappearing into his own smoke. The Japanese battleships and cruisers, suddenly aware of torpedoes in the water, began evasive maneuvers. Yamato, the pride of the combined fleet, turned away and opened range. The torpedoes missed, but the mission was accomplished. The battleship was temporarily out of position. Her firing solution disrupted. Johnston re-emerged from the smoke and began engaging with her 5-inch guns. The range was absurd for destroyer gunnery over 18,000 yards, but Evans kept firing. One shell struck heavy cruiser Kumano, starting a fire that would eventually force the cruiser to withdraw. USS Hole, under Commander Leon Kintberger, launched her torpedoes at heavy cruiser Haguro from 9,000 yards. At least one torpedo hit, blowing off a section of the cruiser's bow. Hole then turned toward heavy cruiser, Tone, and fired her remaining torpedoes. Japanese return fire was devastating. Shells from multiple cruisers bracketed Hole. A 14-inch shell from battleship Congo struck the destroyer's port engine room, killing everyone inside instantly and cutting power to half the ship. More hits followed. The bridge took a direct hit. Quintuple was killed. The executive officer assumed command and kept the surviving 5-inch guns firing until flooding made the ship unmanageable. Hull capsized and sank at 0855 hours. Of her 253-man crew, 86 survived. USS Heermann, the ship Ensign Miller served on, wove through the Japanese formation like a boxer slipping punches. Commander Amos Hathaway, Heermann's captain, navigated between battleships and cruisers, firing torpedoes at one target while his guns engaged another. At one point, Heermann passed so close to battleship Haruna that the battleship's 14-inch guns could not depress far enough to hit her. Hathaway fired his last torpedoes at battleship Nagato, forcing the ship to turn away. Japanese shells struck Heermann multiple times, but none penetrated the engine spaces or magazines. The destroyer survived, battered, but afloat. The torpedo attacks forced the Japanese formation to scatter. Kurita lost cohesion. His battleships and cruisers maneuvered independently to avoid torpedoes, breaking concentration of fire. The escort carriers, given precious minutes by the destroyer's sacrifice, launched every available aircraft. Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers, armed with whatever ordnance was available, some carried depth charges, since no armor-piercing bombs were aboard. The aircraft attacked repeatedly, coordinating with the destroyers to maintain pressure on the Japanese force. The destroyer escorts smaller, slower, less heavily armed than the Fletchers joined the attack. USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort displacing only 1,350 tons, with 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes, charged into the fight alongside the destroyers. Her crew fought with such ferocity that Japanese sailors later reported they thought she was a light cruiser. She was sunk, but not before her guns damaged heavy cruiser Chikuma badly enough that aircraft finished the job. The engagement lasted 2.5 hours. When Kurita finally ordered withdrawal, he left behind 3 heavy cruisers sunk or sinking. The Americans lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, and multiple aircraft. But the invasion fleet, the primary target, remained untouched. The most powerful surface force Japan could assemble had been turned back by a handful of small carriers and destroyer escorts, with 3 Fletcher-class destroyers leading the charge. Commander Evans went down with Johnston. His body was never recovered. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive the decoration. Commander Quintuple of Hull received the Navy Cross posthumously. Commander Hathaway of Heermann survived and received the Navy Cross as well. But perhaps more significant than the decorations was the recognition throughout the Navy that the Fletcher-class destroyers had performed exactly as designed. They had delivered overwhelming torpedo firepower, absorbed tremendous punishment, and maintained combat effectiveness even when outnumbered and outgunned. The battle became legend, and rightfully so. But beneath the heroism and sacrifice was a technical reality. The Fletcher-class destroyers performed exactly as designed. The 10-torpedo battery was not a gimmick. It was a war-winning advantage that forced enemy capital ships to maneuver defensively, breaking their formation and disrupting their attack. The gun armament allowed sustained fire even after torpedoes were expended. The engineering plant kept delivering power despite battle damage. The radar and fire control allowed accurate gunnery under conditions where optical sighting was nearly impossible. Japanese post-war analysis, conducted by surviving officers and naval architects, acknowledged the Fletcher's impact with a candor that would have been impossible during the war. Captain Toshikazu Omei, who served in multiple destroyer commands and later contributed to the post-war rebuilding of the Maritime Self-Defense Force, wrote extensively about the Pacific War's naval engagements. In his assessment of American destroyer design, he stated that the Fletcher represented the ideal balance between firepower, protection, and operational flexibility. Omei noted that Japanese designers had been trapped by pre-war assumptions about tonnage limits imposed by naval treaties and the necessity of maximizing speed and torpedo armament above all else. The result was ships that excelled in specific conditions, night surface engagements at moderate ranges with good visibility, but struggled when those conditions did not materialize. Japanese destroyers were faster than Fletchers in calm seas, more maneuverable in some speed ranges, and carried the superior Type 93 torpedo. But they were also more fragile, more difficult to maintain, and less adaptable to changing tactical requirements. The broader lesson extended beyond ship design. The Fletcher-class destroyers were products of an integrated industrial system that valued standardization, mass production, and incremental improvement. The ships shared common parts across multiple builders. Turbines manufactured in Pennsylvania fit into hulls built in California. Fire control systems produced in New York integrated seamlessly with guns manufactured in Washington. This interchangeability meant that damaged ships could be repaired quickly using components from other vessels or from depot stocks. It meant that crews could transfer between ships without retraining on fundamentally different equipment. Training was standardized across the fleet. Every Fletcher-class destroyer used the same damage control procedures, the same gunnery, doctrine, the same torpedo firing solutions. When a ship discovered an effective technique in one theater, the innovation was documented, distributed through the fleet via training bulletins, and incorporated into standard operating procedures. USS Walk developed an improved method for coordinating 5-inch fire with 40mm mounts during kamikaze defense. Within 6 weeks, every Fletcher-class destroyer in the Pacific had received the updated procedures and implemented them. Japan's industrial system, smaller and more fragmented, could not replicate this approach. Each shipyard had its own methods. Kure Naval Arsenal built destroyers differently than Maizuru or Sasebo. Each naval district preferred different modifications to standard designs. Communication between fleets was slow and often disrupted by submarine attacks on courier ships. By 1944, some Japanese destroyers were fighting with equipment and tactics from 1941, while others had improvised modifications that made maintenance difficult and crew training inconsistent. The human cost of this disparity was measured in thousands of lives. Japanese destroyer crews fought with extraordinary courage, but courage could not compensate for obsolete doctrine and inadequate resources. The average Japanese destroyer sailor in late 1944 had perhaps 3 months of training before being assigned to a combat unit. Many had never fired a gun at a moving target or practiced damage control beyond basic drills. They learned in combat or they died. American destroyer sailors, many of them teenagers on their first deployment, arrived at their ships with 6 to 9 months of intensive training behind them. They had practiced gunnery until they could load and fire in their sleep. They had drilled damage control until they could seal a hull breach in darkness. They had learned radar operation, fire control, navigation, and engineering from instructors who rotated back from combat assignments, bringing current tactical knowledge. The Fletcher's design encouraged this level of training. The ship's systems were complex but logical. The radar could be operated by a technician with basic electronics training. The fire control computer required careful maintenance, but was remarkably robust. The engineering plant, while powerful, was not temperamental. A well-trained crew could keep a Fletcher operational for months with minimal shore support. A poorly trained crew would struggle, but the ship's redundancy and design margins provided some cushion for error. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer a functional fighting force. The combined fleet, which had terrorized the Pacific in 1942, existed primarily on paper. Destroyers that survived the attrition of 1,943 and 1,944 were tied to port by fuel shortages, or pressed into convoy escort duties where they could do little against American submarines. The few still capable of offensive operations were husbanded for the final defense of the home islands, the battle that never came. The Fletcher-class destroyers, meanwhile, operated with near impunity. They bombarded coastal targets in support of amphibious assaults. They escorted the invasion fleets at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, providing anti-aircraft defense and naval gunfire support. They stood radar picket duty against kamikaze attacks, positioned 50 to 100 miles from the main fleet to provide early warning. This duty was among the most dangerous of the war. Isolated, Often without close air support, the radar picket destroyers absorbed the full fury of Japan's final desperation weapon. USS Laffey, stationed on radar picket duty off Okinawa on the 16th of April 1945, endured the most intense kamikaze attack any ship survived during the war. Over 80 minutes, 22 aircraft attacked the ship in waves. The engagement began at 0830 hours, when 4 HED-3A, VAL, dive bombers approached from the north. Laffey's Combat Air Patrol, 4 F-4U Corsairs, intercepted and shot down 3. The fourth pressed through and dropped a 550-pound bomb that struck the fantail, destroying the aft 5-inch mount and killing or wounding its entire crew. More aircraft appeared. Laffey's remaining 5-inch mounts opened fire, joined by the 40mm and 20mm batteries. A Zero fighter dove through the defensive fire and crashed into the port 40mm mount. The explosion killed 11 men and started a major fire. Damage control teams fought the blaze while the ship's gunners continued engaging incoming aircraft. A bomb struck the water alongside, the near-miss rupturing hull plates below the waterline. Flooding began in the after-engine room. A second Zero crashed into the superstructure, its engine penetrating into the radar plot. Another bomb hit forward, destroying the forward deckhouse and killing Commander Frederick Beckton's executive officer. Beckton, wounded but still functional, remained on the bridge directing the ship's defense. The rudder jammed hard left from bomb damage, causing Laffey to steam in circles. The engineering officer managed to balance propeller thrust to partially compensate, keeping the ship moving unpredictably enough to complicate the kamikaze pilot's aiming. More aircraft attacked. A VAL crashed into the starboard side, its bomb detonating inside the ship. Another Zero hit near the waterline, flooding additional compartments. The aft magazines were threatened by fire. The crew flooded them manually, sacrificing the ammunition to save the ship. Of Laffey's 5 5-inch mounts, only 3 remained operational. The 40mm mounts were reduced to 4 barrels. Half the 20mm guns were silent, their crews dead or the weapons damaged beyond immediate repair. The attack finally ended at 0947 hours, when Laffey's Combat Air Patrol, reinforced by additional Corsairs from the fleet carriers, drove off the remaining attackers. Laffey was dead in the water, on fire, flooding, her rudder jammed, her superstructure a shattered ruin. 31 of her crew were dead, over 70 wounded, but she was still afloat. Damage control teams brought the fires under control. The flooding was contained. Tugboats arrived and towed her to Haguro anchorage. Temporary repairs took 6 weeks. Laffey was then towed to Pearl Harbor, underwent more extensive work, and was preparing to return to combat when the war ended. The 5 bombs that hit Laffey and the 4 kamikazes that crashed into her would have sunk any destroyer built before 1940. The Fletcher-class hull, with its welded construction and compartmentalized design, absorbed the damage. The watertight integrity held despite multiple breaches. The crew, trained to fight fires and control flooding under combat conditions, kept the ship alive. Commander Beckton received the Navy Cross. Laffey received the Presidential Unit Citation. But the real story was that a Fletcher-class destroyer, hit 9 times by bombs and aircraft, survived and was repaired in time to potentially return to action before war's end. The final tally, compiled after the war, revealed the extent of Fletcher-class dominance in numbers that still astonish. Of 175 ships commissioned between 1,942 and 1,944, 156 survived the war. 19 were lost to enemy action, 13 to kamikazes, 3 to naval gunfire, 2 to mines, 1 to a submarine. No Fletcher was ever sunk by another destroyer in surface combat. They earned 328 battle stars collectively, more than any other ship class in the U.S. Navy. They participated in every major Pacific campaign from Guadalcanal to Tokyo Bay, every Atlantic convoy route, every Mediterranean operation from North Africa to southern France. They sank or participated in sinking 4 Japanese battleships, 11 cruisers, 32 destroyers, 23 submarines, and over 100 auxiliary vessels and transports. They shot down 481 confirmed aircraft. They rescued 4,183 downed pilots and shipwrecked sailors. They bombarded enemy positions with over 9 million rounds of 5-inch ammunition. And they fired 2,841 torpedoes in combat, achieving an estimated hit rate of 18%, not spectacular compared to submarine warfare, but remarkable for surface actions where targets maneuver at high speed and return fire. The 10 torpedoes that stunned Japan in late 1943 were merely the visible tip of a much larger transformation. American naval power in World War II was not built on any single weapon or ship class. It was built on systems industrial, tactical, and human that integrated technology, training, and doctrine into a coherent whole. The Fletcher-class destroyer embodied that integration. It was not the biggest or fastest or most heavily armed ship on the ocean. It was simply the most effective destroyer ever built up to that point in history, and arguably for decades afterward. Commander Moosbrugger, promoted to captain and then rear admiral by war's end, reflected on the Fletchers' success in a post-war interview conducted for the Naval Institute's Oral History Project. He spoke of the crews, the young men from every state who learned to operate complex machinery under fire and did so with a competence that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. He spoke of the designers who balanced competing requirements and produced a ship that could do everything well rather than one thing perfectly. And he spoke of the 10 torpedoes, the weapons that changed the calculus of destroyer warfare and forced the enemy to adapt to a new reality they could neither match nor counter. The legacy extended far beyond 1,945. Many Fletcher-class destroyers served into the 1,972nd, some into the 1,982nd. They were transferred to Allied navies, where they continued fighting in regional conflicts and Cold War confrontations. They served in Korea, where their 5-inch guns provided fire support for United Nations ground forces. They served in Vietnam, where they conducted naval gunfire missions and plane guard duty for carriers. Spain, Greece, Turkey, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, all operated Fletcher-class destroyers in the post-war decades. The last Fletcher in active service, Bam Quitlahuac of the Mexican Navy, was finally decommissioned in 2001, 58 years after the class entered service. Naval architects studied them for decades, using the design as a benchmark for what a balanced warship should achieve. The Soviet Navy's Kotlin-class destroyers, entering service in the 1,952nd, showed clear influence from Fletcher design principles. The British Daring class, Japan's Akizuki class, France's Surcouf class, all incorporated lessons learned from studying the Fletcher's balanced approach to firepower, protection, and sustainability. The modern Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, backbone of today's U.S. Navy, can trace a direct lineage through successive destroyer generations back to the Fletcher and the design philosophy it embodied. And sailors, American and foreign, who served aboard them, spoke of the ships with a respect reserved for platforms that did exactly what they promised when it mattered most. There are still Fletcher-class destroyer reunions, growing smaller each year as the veterans age, but attended faithfully by men who understood that they served on something special. They knew their ships were good not because of any single characteristic, but because every characteristic worked together in a way that created something greater than the sum of parts. In the end, Japan's shock at facing destroyers with 10 torpedoes was not merely about the weapons themselves. It was about the recognition that they were fighting an enemy capable of producing such ships by the hundreds, crewing them with trained sailors by the thousands, and employing them with a tactical sophistication that negated every traditional advantage Japanese forces had relied upon. The 10 torpedoes were a symbol of that disparity, visible and quantifiable, easy to understand even for officers who could not grasp the complexities of radar-directed fire control or industrial base management. But the real story was the system behind them, the industrial might that built a Fletcher every 8 days at peak production, the training pipeline that created competent crews faster than ships could be commissioned, the logistical network that kept them supplied and operational thousands of miles from home, the tactical doctrine that evolved with each engagement, and the human determination that made victory not just possible, but inevitable. The Fletcher-class destroyer was the physical manifestation of all these elements, and the 10 torpedoes sitting ready in their quintuple mounts were the proof that America had learned to fight at sea with a proficiency that no enemy could match. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.